The topic of comic book movies in the modern world is one that is difficult. It seems that the general public enjoys them for the most part, with a good percent actually loving them. MCU merchandise is everywhere, and people all over social media seem excited when a new Marvel film is announced. However, there is a smaller group of people that do not enjoy the modern comic book movie, and those are typically people who are very into the film world. A major complaint about recent comic book movies is fan service. This is when something happens in comic book films that really has no purpose and is just strictly there to please fans. Fan service was all over the recent Deadpool vs. Wolverine movie. Several characters from early Marvel films appeared, watering down the story to explain how all these characters ended up in the film. Unfortunately, this appears to be the standard for modern comic book films. They focus less on being actual films and having a good story than they do appealing to fans. There was a brief period when comic book movies were actually really good movies, the early 2000s. These films included Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy, Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy, and Zack Snyder's Watchmen. There was one comic book film that was like no other of the time, standing out above the rest, and that is Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. Before Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, director Edgar Wright had released 3 films and a TV show, all of them showcasing an unprecedented style of filmmaking. Wright's films Shaun of the Dead and Hot Fuzz not only changed the game for British comedy, but it changed the game for comedy in general. While the comedy films of Judd Apatow, Jay Roach, and the Farrelly brothers were successful and oftentimes actually comedic, the filmmaking style was stale compared to what Wright was doing, and he took this style to a whole nother level in Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, elevating not just the comedy genre, but the comic book genre too. The film is based on Brian Lee O'Malley's 6-volume Scott Pilgrim series about a 23-year-old indie rocker who has to fight his new girlfriend's 7 evil exes before he can date her. O'Malley's comics pay homage to indie culture, and especially Nintendo and Sega video games, giving Wright 3 aesthetics to play with in his film: comic books, video games, and indie culture. Wright plays with the comic book aesthetic by recreating panels exactly how they appear in the comics. Panels from the source material is something that has influenced scenes in several comic book films pretty much ever since the start of comic book films. This is something Zack Snyder did a lot in his Watchmen adaptation. But Wright's composition, set design, dialogue, timing, everything is almost exactly like the source material. Wright even told his actors not to blink during filming so it would be more accurate to the comics. Wright also uses comic book-like onomatopoeia, title cards, and motion lines throughout to add to the style. While it doesn't make anything feel real like Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy, never forgetting you're watching a comic book adaptation is part of the fun. The Scott Pilgrim comic series is a wild time and it is hilarious. To add a realism element to the film adaptation just wouldn't work. The full-on comic book immersion is what makes Scott Pilgrim vs. the World the film it is. Aside from comic books, Wright also uses references to and direct elements of video games. The very first thing the audience sees is a 64-bit version of the Universal Studios logo. The Universal Studios theme is also in the style of a 64-bit video game. This is only the beginning of the video game references and elements throughout the film. Young Neil is almost always playing video games, Scott and Knives play that one ninja video game, Scott says he learned the bass line from Final Fantasy V, people turn into coins when they are defeated, when people get punched Scott gains points, Scott gains a 1-up token similar to the Super Mario Bros. Games, and there is a KO sound effect and title card when Scott defeats Matthew Patel in the style of the Mortal Kombat video games. Every fight scene is stylized heavily to be like a video game, which is not only making the film a stronger adaptation of the comics, but it's again making Scott Pilgrim vs. the World a comic book film that seems to have so much more care put into it than the films we get now. What makes Scott Pilgrim vs. the World stand out the most, though, is its dedication to indie culture. This is something that Wright expands upon, as it is no secret that he knows a lot about indie culture, but it's mainly something that comes directly from the source material. The name Scott Pilgrim comes from the Plumtree song, also titled Scott Pilgrim. And who's Plumtree? Exactly. Plumtree was a Canadian indie rock band in the 90s, but while they're not around today, I'm not sure people really even knew about them in the 90s. Basing your main character off of a song from a band that no one's heard of is exactly the type of tone the characters in Scott Pilgrim vs. the World give off. Scott doesn't have a job and sleeps on the floor with his roommate. He's in a band with his friends who also don't really have jobs. Scott performs at and goes to indie concert venues, and he goes to record stores and coffee shops. Everything about the film screams 90s to 2010s hipster and is something I've yet to see in other comic book films. Is that mainly because no other comic books are about the same subject? Yes, but because the hipster tone of Scott Pilgrim, the film feels very personal to humanity, and I've never gotten that in other comic book films, which seems like why Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is more focused on being a film first, before it focuses on appealing to fans of the comics.